So would you kindly enlighten us as to what your journey was?
Well, it kind of goes back to my early 20s. I'll just briefly tell you a psychological transformation that I went through at that time, virtually an overnight transformation. I had just been awarded a scholarship, research scholarship for Cambridge University, so I'd been doing quite well on an external level. Everybody considered that my life was successful, but inside I was suffering from very deep depressions and continuous states of anxiety, and I had been suffering from that for years. So I was actually miserably unhappy, while everybody else around me thought that I was a very successful person. So there was one night when I reached a kind of depth of a depression, and a thought kept reoccurring in my mind that I can't live with myself any longer. The pain of this dreadful unhappiness is too much. I can't take it anymore. I can't live with myself any longer. And that sentence became a trigger for a transformation. I cannot live with myself any longer. And suddenly I thought, what does this mean? Who is the I and who is the self that I cannot live with? There was a kind of separation that occurred at that moment. I separated myself, my sense of identity separated from the unhappy, depressed and anxious person, and suddenly there was me here observing that unhappy self. So there was a disidentification, and I thought, how is that possible? I can now observe the unhappiness as if it were in me, but not essentially me. So that was, I described that in a little bit more detail in the book. When I woke up the next morning, I was in a state of very deep peace, and that lasted for several months, and it never really left me, but that deeply blissful state lasted for several months, and I didn't know what had happened to me. How is it possible that from one day being a very anxious person, I could suddenly become transformed into a deeply peaceful person? And it was only years later that I understood what actually had happened to me at that time. So in a way...
What was it?
It's a realization that the suffering me is ultimately a fiction of the mind. I had created a mental fiction that I believed in and identified with. You could call it the ego. And through the pressure of suffering, I separated from that fiction. And when I separated from that fiction, it collapsed as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy, because it ultimately wasn't real. I realized then that the suffering self wasn't ultimately real. It was a fiction. And in a way, that's also the basis of the book. And when I later started to work with people, very often people came to me who were in some kind of suffering, some form of pain. And what I'm trying to convey and teach is that it is possible to live free of suffering, to go beyond suffering.